Привет, comrades. Today we will be talking about communism, the history of communism, off the top of my head, because I'm not an expert or anything, but I have watched a few lectures and I took a politics class, so I know a few things about communism. Take what I say with a grain of salt. Take what I say with a grain of salt because, again, I'm not an expert, and I'm probably going to forget a few details. So if you're really interested, you can research the topic, but this is just ASMR communism. So, we'll start from the Benin King. Before we get into the history of communism, we have to go way back to the other economic systems. We start with, back with cavemen. You have an economic system of just bartering. I give you whatever item, you give me whatever item back, just bartering. And that's the most simple economic system, but things start evolving when at some point, for some reason, not sure, there could be multiple reasons. Could be for religion or people not being able to make it in the world on their own, or it could be a multitude of reasons, but basically slaves came into existence. And so you had the first of many in a long pattern. Let me start this over. So, when you have slave and master, this is the first kind of pattern, the first part in a pattern where someone has control over someone else in regards to economy. This was the most obvious form because you got a slave, they have to do everything the master tells them, right? So, yeah. After a certain point, after Rome, fell apart, we devolved into feudalism. You had lords, knights, kings, and serfs. And at this point, the same relationship between slave and master you would see between lord and serf. The serf works for the lord on the lord's land. What the hell is the serf gonna do? I mean, they can't really go anywhere. And so, after enough of this feudalism and of this lord and serf, master and slave, someone always being on top, controlling someone else, the idea of capitalism came into existence, and everyone thought this would free everyone. It would be freedom. If you put enough hard work in, you could be on top of the food chain with enough work. That's how capitalism worked. But, it started off very small, and it slowly expanded until capitalism became the main we see today. But now that capitalism has been around long enough, we see that the same pattern has transpired. We see the capitalist and the worker, the employer and the employee. The same pattern of someone having control over someone else in an economic sense. Not every employee can just go to a different job. So, that's the basic idea. But we have now capitalism has had its critics for a while. This employer, employee, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Because, yes, if you put in the work, you can go to the top. But if someone's already put in the work, and you're born into riches, you're rich. If no one's put in the work in your family, and you're born into poverty, I mean, you gotta put in a lot of work. Sometimes, no matter how much work you can put in, like, you're only gonna move to maybe like working class, middle class, something like that. So it depends. So yeah, capitalism has had its critics for a while, and people credit Karl Marx for coming up with communism. He didn't really, the idea of, well, socialism and communism had kind of been the same thing at that point, at least. But that the idea had existed before Karl Marx. But he wrote it down in his book Das Kapital. Now, this idea of socialism / communism, I think he called it communism. Yeah, he called it communism. So what Karl Marx defined communism as at that point was basically, at some point in the future, everyone would realize that capitalism was bad, and they would revolt against the people in power, the people who own the means of production, who we would call the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, the working people, would protest, or they would take down the bourgeoisie. And then all the wealth would be spread equally amongst everyone. All government and state would be abolished. There would be no more power oppressing people anymore. Everyone would finally be free, and they would kind of live in this anarchist kind of society, except everyone's equal, so wealth-wise, at least close to equal. And wealth-wise, within like a reasonable margin. So, he had the anarcho-communist idea, but that's what he wrote out. Now, we have to fast forward to Russia in early 1900s. There was a Tsar Nicholas II, and he came into power, and he stated he'd be a really bad person to lead the country, or like a really bad leader or something like that. I don't have exact quotes. This is off the top of my head. But yeah, he didn't want to be Tsar of Russia, but he was Tsar of Russia nonetheless, so he ended up doing his duties. Anyway, and he had a wife. I don't remember what the wife's name was. We'll call her Natasha for now, because that sounds like a vaguely Russian name. Maybe. Anyway, Natasha, both Tsar Nicholas II and Natasha had an affinity, or some sort of fascination with the occult. And that would become very apparent when they met a man named Rasputin. Rasputin was a holy man, or so he said. He ended up healing the Tsar's son from almost death. And that is when Tsar Nicholas knew that he wanted Rasputin around. So Rasputin ended up becoming part of the royal court. And so Rasputin, if you know about Rasputin's the guy who would there was this weird thing he did where he would get a bunch of people, they would all go out in the forest and they'd all have an orgy, and they'd all sin a shit ton, and then they'd all confess to God, and that was supposed to bring them closer to God. This was the kind of guy Rasputin was. He had a lot of sex, we'll say that. But he appeared to have mystical powers. And he saved the Tsar's son's life, so they were interested in him. And everyone all over Russia was very interested in Rasputin, so for his supposedly being a man of God. Anyway, a guy named Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and this started a war, a very big war. A lot of countries got involved, and this became known as World War I. Russia got involved. And after a certain point, Tsar Nicholas II decided he was going to go on the front line of the battlefield and direct the soldiers. He was going to directly go out and direct his soldiers on the battlefield. He wasn't going to leave that to the generals. He was going to do it himself. Now, mind you, Tsar Nicholas II wasn't a good leader. He didn't want to be a leader, but he wanted to be the face of Russia, and he wanted Russia to look strong in that battlefield. And he wanted to raise morale, so he went out himself. And he thought he was doing a good thing with that life had been getting very close to Rasputin. Rasputin was like, I believe he was like taking care of the kids when like they were away, and he was just getting extremely close to the royal family. So when Tsar Nicholas II left to go to war, Rasputin became the new Tsar. He wasn't officially the Tsar, but he became a very powerful man. And Rasputin is the kind of guy who people would see him like just having these extreme arguments with himself, like yelling at his demons. And was he a good fit for the leader of Russia? Not really. Tsar Nicholas II wasn't either, but anyway, another problem with Tsar Nicholas II leading the troops was that every failure that Russia had in battle was attributed directly to Tsar Nicholas II. And when Russia wasn't doing good, everyone was angry at the Tsar. So people revolted, and Russia ended up having to pull out of World War I, and a new world order, or not a new world order, but a new order in Russia came when the communists ended up murdering the Tsar and his family and taking over, ruling Russia. And now Vladimir Lenin was the head of the Communist Party. Now, communism at this stage was supposed to mimic what Marx had believed communism was. This was the goal Vladimir Lenin and his communists wanted to achieve, was to capture the state and then break down the state in order to achieve communism. Now, Vladimir Lenin did some things which would make you think his intentions were at least somewhat genuine. And he made the entire country of Russia atheist because he thought that religion was a tool used by the bourgeoisie to keep the proletariat in line. And he stopped the production of vodka. No one was allowed to drink alcohol because vodka was also a tool used by the bourgeoisie to keep the proletariat in line. Because if we flash back a long time ago, vodka started getting made just kind of by many different people, and one of the czars said, hey, that's a good market. I'm gonna make it so only the czar can produce vodka. So you would get a shit ton of money. That's what happened. Vodka became a tool of the bourgeoisie and the Tsar. So office for 2 years before he died. Was he going to break down the state? We don't know what true communism had, because this is, okay, because Marx had described that the people would rebel, take down the bourgeoisie, take down the state, and there would be no government. But what Vladimir Lenin and the other communists did, they rebelled. They took down the bourgeoisie, but they kept the government. They made their own government. So, would he have taken down the government, and would he have created communism as Marx intended it, if given long enough? We don't exactly know, because he died 2 years in, and Joseph Stalin became the new head of the Communist Party. Joseph Stalin was notoriously a fucking asshole. He fucking ruined communism as we know it. And he committed genocide too. He did a lot of shitty things. I think one of the first things he did, because Vladimir Lenin was always saying, we haven't achieved communism yet, because we haven't broken down the state yet. And what Stalin did when he came into office, he said, no, this is communism. We have achieved communism. He wanted the approval of the people. And everyone's like, yeah, we achieved communism, but they didn't achieve communism. They did not achieve communism. They, in fact, Joseph Stalin redefined communism into something much more sinister. Joseph Stalin ended up, he started vodka production again, and just like the czars, he had a monopoly on the vodka production. So now, after everyone had spent a couple years sobering up, after all their ridiculously long addiction, vodka had started to be produced again in order to keep the in order to keep the commoners in line. I don't want to say proletariat because, while Stalin does have power, I wouldn't necessarily call, well, yeah, okay, maybe he is the bourgeoisie. He does kind of own means of production. I don't know. Anyway, those are words to define, but yeah, you can make a profit off of vodka production, and those two things alone, before we get into the genocide, kind of gave you a glimpse into his motives. They weren't pure, but in the communist society, there's a thing, or at least in the Soviet society, Soviet Russia, the Soviet Union, not Soviet Russia, there's a thing called a nomenclature, and the nomenclature was a ranking of everyone in the nation. Whoever was at the top of the nomenclature, they were the head of the party, and then the next few people down, they were like in like the high council, and then like the next few hundred, they would like meet every year or something. Like, I don't remember the exact specifics, but like the higher you were shortages. And that's not the only reason you get shortages. You also get shortages because if you're paying everyone equally, some people just don't give a fuck to work as hard as they could be. And you get shortages that way because people are just like, well, I'm getting paid the same as the guy over there who's, just barely doing anything. I was about to say, well, I'm getting paid as much as the guy over there who just shit his pants and passed out, but that guy's not getting paid. That guy's getting whipped or executed or dragged off or fired or something. But yeah, you get paid no matter how hard you work, as long as you work a little bit, because there are people there to make sure you're working. But yeah, those are kind of the two reasons for shortages. So there's a lot of shortages in communism, so it's not, especially government communism. Communism, it exists in a lot of places, but in really small, very small, tight-knit groups. You could say families exhibit communism, some tribes exhibit communism. It's a very local thing, but when you do it on a government scale, it doesn't work. Not that we've seen in an effective manner. Anyway, back to Joseph Stalin. I was talking about something about Joseph Stalin. The nomenclature, right. Joseph Stalin was a very paranoid individual, and he would if you rose up the nomenclature too quickly, he would kill you, because he was afraid that you could overtake him in power. He would just assassinate you, send someone over to assassinate you. If you were doing the communist dream really well, he got scared and he assassinated you. But if you protested him, or you had ideas, maybe not protest, but you had ideas against him and someone snitched on you, you got executed. Or you got sent to the gulags. There was mass killings. Stalin had mass killings of people he was either these were all people he was afraid of, because he didn't want anyone challenging him at all. And that's how he was there for 30 years. 30 some odd years. I don't remember exactly how long. I want to say 35, but I'm sure that's true. Anyway, so a lot of people were afraid of Stalin, didn't really want to go against him because they were going to die. And I believe China, but it was communist now. And he did a lot of things that people doubted him on, but he ended up doing them right. To the point where he thought he could never be wrong. And he ended up creating a new culture, the Maoism culture, I think. We're like, yeah, there's something about him, like, stopping education, or, like, higher education. He didn't like the intellectuals or something. I can't tell you much about Maoism, but basically what all of this ended in with him doing a bunch of things right, and he thought his ego was way up here, and he thought he was the shit because he got everything right. He ended up creating this 5-year plan to improve production in China. And what ended up happening, because people didn't want to, it was like the farmers were instructed to make steel in their free time, but they didn't have time to make steel. They're farmers. I mean, they farm, they don't make steel. Do they even know how to make steel? I mean, you supplied them with things to make steel, but or they were making steel tools or something. Yeah, they were making steel. Something to do with steel. But, yeah. The people who went out to collect shit from farmers, they didn't want to get executed by Mao, because Mao was inspired by Stalin, because for some inexplicable reason he thought Stalin was his idol. So they didn't want to get executed by Mao. So what they did, they took all the stuff that the farmers farmed, and the farmers didn't exactly farm as much as Mao wanted, because Mao wanted all this extra stuff, which wasn't really physically possible, so they just threw in a bunch of seeds. They threw in all the seeds and just said, oh, that's the food that they farmed. Yes. And instead of getting the steel that they wanted, they melted the farmers' tools, used that as steel, walked away. Now the farmers are left with no tools, no seeds for next year. They couldn't farm. And that became a very big problem. A lot of people starved to death, and Mao basically indirectly killed more people than Stalin. There's a big accident, but a very, very bad accident. Anyway, so then I want to go back to the Russia side, because let's go back to Russia. So back to Russia, we have Joseph Stalin, right? And everyone's afraid of him because he's fucking Joseph Stalin. Like, he's fucking Joseph Stalin. If you're not afraid of him, you're fucking crazy. Anyway, he gets sick and he's gonna die, and save him. The doctor did not save his life. Yet so many people fear him. I think the doctor feared that he would get executed for, like, not saving his life properly. I don't think it was even a thing of, like, hey, I don't like Stalin. But, yeah, Stalin died. Doctor just didn't want to save his life. So after his reign of terror, we had Nikita Khrushchev come into Joseph Stalin's place as the head of the Russian Communist Party, the Soviet Communist Party. Let's put it that way. It's not Russian yet. The Soviet Union, if we would like to elaborate, was a union of a lot of different states, such as Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Estonia, Lithuania, I think. There's just a lot of states in Georgia. Always remember Georgia. Anyway, so the Soviet Union was a mix of a lot of states. So Nikita Khrushchev was now the head of the Soviet Communist Party, and Nikita Khrushchev decided, like, I think the first thing he said, he had, like, a speech he was gonna do for the people now that he was the leader of basically the whole nation. One of the first things he said was, there will be no more mass killings. And everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Now, Nikita Khrushchev wasn't perfect, but he was better than Stalin. He did kill people like Stalin out of paranoia to keep his spot on the top, but he killed not anywhere near as many people as Stalin. Like, absolutely nowhere near. And he was kind of a lot more harsh with the U.S. with the whole Cold War thing than Stalin, as Stalin, kind of worked with the U.S. in World War II. But he was nicer to his people, we'll say that. I suppose now that we're in Cold War, that I mentioned the Cold War, I can mention the, how these communist nations get all this money for all these nuclear weapons. Okay, so I've mentioned how Marxist communism works, right? But if we're looking at this kind of like government communism, it's a different thing. It's a whole different beast. All the people, they do their work, and all the production, the money and shit, it goes to the government. Okay? And the government then redistributes it to the people, right? But before they were redistributed to the people, they have to pay government funds. They pay your taxes for you. basic government things like roads and shit. And let me take $1 million out just to fund my nuclear weapons program. Let me pocket a few thousand. Let my friend Joe over there pocket a couple more thousand. Let's put a shit ton of money into the military because we gotta defend ourselves from the Americans. And then we'll distribute it evenly among everyone. Yeah. So they always had the ability. They could fund their nuclear weapons before feeding their people. And it's kind of sad if you think about it. But it allowed the Soviet Union to compete with America on a global scale. And during Nikita Khrushchev's reign, and possibly a little bit during Stalin's, actually, I'm not entirely sure, but Nikita Khrushchev was definitely the person who hammered down the Cold War thing with the space race and the nukes and all this shit. There was a war of ideas between the U.S. and the USSR, the Soviet Union, yeah. To the point where the U.S. did not want communism to spread and activated policies to make sure that communism did not spread to any new countries. And this led to things like them helping out in the Vietnam War and the Vietnam War and the Korean War, which were things that seemed to have absolutely nothing to do with the U.S. or the Soviet Union, but they were proxy wars because neither the Soviet Union nor the U.S. wanted the other to end up gaining that extra little ground for their ideology, because both sides believed that if one side gained too much power, they could domino effect and wipe out the other side. So they both wanted to remain as powerful as they could. Hopefully wiping out the other side one day. So that took a lot of nukes to do. With communism kind of covering almost half of Europe, maybe a whole half of Europe, maybe more than half of Europe, about half of Europe. Communism was covering half of Europe with the Soviet Union. The ideas of socialism came into play in countries near the Soviet Union, where they didn't necessarily want communism, but the idea of, equaling it out a little bit was not a bad idea. And so those ideas persist into the modern day. Communism in the modern day, not so much. Except for China, which is starting to fade away from that. Anyway, so was too nice. It's sad that it took a reasonable person being head of the Soviet Union to fall. That's what it took. He was too nice. He couldn't do it. That's not detailed of an explanation enough, but I'm drinking water, so. Anyway, Mikhail Gorbachev was the only communist leader to be born in Soviet Russia, or the Soviet Union. So I just want to say Soviet Russia, damn it. Just want to say Soviet Russia. It's like too much to ask. It's like Soviet Russia. Okay. All of the other leaders or heads of the Communist Party, they were born before the Soviet Union was formed. But Mikhail Gorbachev, he was born during the Soviet Union, and he was born during the reign of Stalin, and he witnessed that in his childhood firsthand, and he never wanted to replicate what Stalin did. He didn't want to be anything like Stalin. That was his goal. He didn't want to be like Stalin. That was it. Now, Mikhail Gorbachev, he believed in the Soviet Union. He believed the Soviet Union needed some changes to survive, but he believed the Soviet Union could survive. And so, he ended up, after a certain point, he created this idea of opt-out, the idea of opting out of communism. You could opt out of communism and make your own money. And some people did that. Yeah, this is the time right now where I should probably explain one crucial part of the communist government in the Soviet Union, and that was in the higher council or whatever the fuck, they were allowed to debate issues, but when they all came out of the room, they would all stand united. After all their voting or debating or whatever was done, they would all pretend they all agreed on the issue. They all agreed and voted the same way. This was a tactic to make it seem like if you had a viewpoint that was different, no one was going to support you because no one else had that viewpoint, and you would be fucking crazy to have that viewpoint. assassinate people. He did not want to be the person to do what Stalin did. He absolutely refused to assassinate people. And because of this, a military coup ended up happening. It was a failed coup, but they tried to coup. Actually, I don't know if it was a military coup, but I know it was a coup. We'll say that a coup ended up happening. So, this was the first time that people had ever seen any disagreement in the communist government. And people looked around and they were like, what's happening? And Mikhail Gorbachev resigned from No. Hold on. Now there's one crucial part before the resignation. There was a man named Boris Yeltsin, and he created this referendum all across the Soviet Union, and he asked people, should the Soviet Union disband into its different states, or should the Soviet Union stay together? A lot of people did not vote on this referendum because they thought it was bullshit. Who the fuck was Boris Yeltsin? He couldn't do this. Well, he did do this, and the referendum said the states should split apart. So they did. That was somehow Boris Yeltsin gained power. Mikhail Gorbachev resigned from his office. Soviet Union was done. Probably went and cried. But Mikhail Gorbachev's still alive, I think, today. Actually, I don't know if he's alive today, but he was alive recently. There ended up being this thing that Boris Yeltsin made. They were kind of like vouchers, which everyone kind of was. There was like vouchers for different products or whatever. Boris Yeltsin kind of gave that to everyone, and a lot of people were like, "What the fuck is this? This is garbage. I don't know what the fuck this is," and they threw it away. Or they gave it to people who wanted it. And so, that became a whole failed thing of Boris Yeltsin trying to start the economy back up in a capitalist fashion. The economy actually was worse than what it was in the Soviet Union for just a little bit. But it slowly got better. I forgot to mention the oligarchs. Mikhail Gorbachev made this, like, you could opt out of communism and become capitalist thing, there were a lot of people who were really high up on the Nomenclature who had a lot of information about the economy and what to invest in and what not, who ended up opting out of communism and becoming capitalists. And because of this information, they became really fucking rich. And these people are known as the oligarchs in Russia. These people who got really rich off of opting out of communism. But yeah, I could go into the whole Vladimir Putin getting like 6 extra terms or whatever the fuck he's going for. 4 extra terms, not 6 extra terms, but it'll be 6 extra terms if he lives that long. But this is about communism. So, I'll just say, I'll end it off with China, the only somewhat communist nation left. At least that I know of. I know there was a nation who voted in a communist government, but isn't exactly communist. I think it was Wuhan. Yeah, Wuhan. That did that. But I haven't looked that much into it. China is slowly turning from a communist to a mixed economy to, I think, eventually just a full-on capitalist economy. Mate, with Xi Jinping in power, it'll probably stay a mixed economy, but at some point, I think it'll become capitalist. And the government communism that Joseph Stalin perpetuated will be no more. Karl Marx wrote down an idea of communism a very long time ago that he himself didn't really even create. It was kind of just floating around with the intellectuals. But Vladimir Lenin enforced it earlier than what, and it wasn't exactly natural, but Joseph Stalin corrupted it into something else, and it's all gonna be gone now. Will we ever get Marxist communism? Unless the world, like, goes into an apocalypse and there's only, like, a few, like, so many people left. I don't think so. Communism has been, the term communism has been destroyed. No one wants it anymore. So yeah. That's the history of communism off the top of my head. Пока, comrades.